Thank you everyone for joining. We'll get started. Thanks for introducing yourself in the chat so we know who's in the room. We have a great group of folks here with us today. My name is Sonal Jessel. I'm the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. We Act is a community-based organization based in Harlem. We work in the neighborhoods of Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood, but do policy on environmental justice at the citywide, statewide, and national levels. We do a lot of work on extreme heat, and this webinar is all about why that is. So we're here today, appropriately today, to talk about extreme weather and heat advisories and how we are addressing that here in New York City, New York State, and what we can learn from across the country. So we can go to the next slide. So just for a quick agenda, first of all, we're going to talk about extreme heat, why this is an issue, how this impacts our health, why this is something we're really worried about. And then the main focus of why we're here today is we're happy to reveal to you all our extreme heat agenda for 2023. This is something we've now done for the past couple of years, is put out an agenda for the things that we are working on at We Act with our partners and folks in the city and the state on how we're addressing extreme heat and things we can do to continue to protect people. Then we'll have some Q&A and we'll go into some next steps, calls to actions, what we're all doing together. So thank you all for being here today once again. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly introduce why we're here. We Act for Environmental Justice. We've been around for about 35 years now, and we really focus on building healthy communities for low-income people and people of color in New York City, but also statewide, and we work on a national level for environmental justice. And over the past couple of years, we've been very deeply in extreme heat work, and that's because in New York City, especially, we're feeling it today, it's getting increasingly hotter as climate change, as our climate crisis gets worse, as global warming worsens. We are seeing extreme heat rise to a level that is extremely deadly. We know from the past couple of days, we've passed records on extreme heat in New York and across the US and across the world. So this is a very relevant issue right now, both on the short term, how we're protecting ourselves, staying away from overheating, going to the hospital, but also what we're doing long term about the issue. And so We Act has the Heat, Health, and Equity Initiative. This is the umbrella under which we do all of our work on extreme heat, which is a multi-year program to address some of these core reasons why certain neighborhoods are sort of experiencing worse impacts of extreme heat, why that is, which we'll get into a little bit more today. And ultimately, this policy agenda that we're proposing is part of our initiative to really push forward action items, both in the long term to protect people from extreme heat, make sure that we have cooling in homes, make sure our neighborhoods are built in a way that is mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis when it comes to heat, but also in the short term, how are we making sure that people are safe in their homes today on a really hot day? So I'm happy to pass it off to Lonnie Portis, our New York City Policy and Advocacy Manager, to talk about why this is an issue.
Great, thanks so much, Sonal. So just kind of start off, as we already know, been very hot last few days, and I want to start off to let people know that, heat waves are increasing in severity, our frequency and duration. Monday, July 3rd, we actually hit a world record that we don't want to ever hit, that we didn't want to hit, but it was the world's hottest day across, on average across the entire globe. And so the world's average temperature reached a new high on Monday, and the high temperatures are due to a combination of El Nino weather events and ongoing emissions from carbon dioxide. So it's the connection between those two, due to those pieces, that has caused, the heat to become so much more extreme and much more frequent with weather events, extreme weather events. And then since the start of the year, researchers have been growing increasingly concerned about rapidly rising temperature on land and in the sea as well. We also have experienced here in the US more recently an extreme heat issue of a dangerous wet bulb temperatures. And wet bulb temperatures, for anyone who doesn't know, are the measurement is designed to mimic how the body how the body tries to cool itself, compared to just the heat index, which tells you how the human body would feel under shade. The wet bulb temperature indicates that expected stress of the human body when there's direct sunlight by measuring the effects of temperature, humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation as well. And so that kind of combination of really, when you're getting to those dangerous wet bulb temperatures, which there's being experienced throughout the South and Southeast, Texas and Louisiana have been subjected to that currently. It's really dangerous, and this is kind of how and why extreme heat kills, and why it's such a really important aspect of environmental health, and one of the deadliest climate change disasters that we have. And then here in New York City, specifically in a lot of urban areas, we have what we call the urban heat island effect. And this is where urbanized areas experience higher temperatures than outlying areas like suburbs and rural areas, because the structures like buildings and roads and other infrastructure pretty much absorb and re-emit the sun's heat more than natural landscapes such as forests and bodies of water. So urban areas where these structures are highly concentrated and greenery is limited, become islands for higher temperatures relative to the outlying areas. New York City is particularly susceptible to these high temperatures because of our physical design characteristics. We are the concrete jungle, and we're known for our steel, our concrete, and we have tons of roads as well. And so this is why we end up with this urban heat island effect. And this is made worse and because of the legacy of redlining. So it extends far beyond just housing segregation. The impact is seen today in communities of color and low-income communities who already have issues with access to healthcare, poor educational opportunities, and increased risk of climate change. Many of these areas are prone to flooding and extreme heat at disproportionate rates. New York City's struggle with inequality causes extreme heat events to disproportionately affect certain populations in neighborhoods. For example, neighborhoods in East Harlem, Central Harlem, and the South Bronx have some of the highest scores on the Heat Vulnerability Index, which is a measurement of heat risk and heat-related illnesses or death. And Black New Yorkers are twice as likely to die following an extreme heat event than any other New Yorkers. So that is kind of how this becomes an environmental justice issue, because of this, the disparity between racial and ethnic groups. So as we talked about before, so extreme heat and how it relates to actual health. Extreme heat events provoke a lot of different adverse health impacts, including dehydration, dizziness, fainting, and actual death. And due to systemic racism and pervasive inequalities, Black and Latinx communities, low-income households, and elderly people are disproportionately affected by these heat-related health outcomes. And much of this inequity, like I mentioned before, comes from structural and historical racism, forcing low-income and people of color in New York City to live in older, poorly maintained apartment buildings, more crowded apartments with intergenerational living. They live in neighborhoods with less green space, or neighborhoods with more air pollution from buildings and industrial sites, and also stretch their resilience and their means across many hardships, such as food, rent, chronic illness, and immigration status. And so there are a lot of different indirect and direct impacts that extreme heat have on individuals' health. And it results in an increased hospitalization admission for heat-related illness as well. So with all of that said, can seem kind of doom and gloom, but the reason why we have the extreme heat agenda that we are, and I'm going to pass it to Caleb Smith, who's our resilience coordinator, is going to talk a little bit about our extreme heat agenda and how we are addressing all of these different impacts that extreme heat have on health. And I will pass it to Caleb.
Thanks, LJ. So before I get into it, the full extreme heat agenda will have more context updates around what's been happening at the federal and state level around funding opportunities like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bond Act and how they can be applied to adaptation and mitigation against extreme heat. For now, I'll focus on the city bills and for folks who have seen our agenda from last year, a lot of it will be familiar, and that's because we're fighting an uphill battle to disrupt this sort of piecemeal seasonal action on extreme heat. And we're continuing to push forward this comprehensive range of approaches all year round, centering social equity and community participation. Next slide. Oh, I think back one, no? There we go. Okay, so the high level overview, there are 8 objectives, and I will discuss 5 city council bills. All of the objectives fit in some combination of the following 3 action schemes. Next slide. Policy and investment, resilient infrastructure, information, communication, and education. I'll cover objective 2, 5, and 6 over the course of this presentation. Next slide. Yeah, so objective 2 is focused on legislative action in the city council to mitigate extreme heat impacts. Next slide. So starting with introduction 102, this is a critical tool for management and accountability in terms of tracking progress of penetration of green roofs in environmental justice and climate justice communities. And this would require the Department of Environmental Protection to post a map of green roofs online. We really need to see where we are and chart a path forward when it comes to deploying a wide array of different technologies to address extreme heat. The next one is Introduction 233, which would require the Department of Education to conduct a study on the feasibility of installing green roofs on schools. And this is particularly important because youth are also a particularly vulnerable group when it comes to heat stress, especially as LJ mentioned, some neighborhoods have a heightened risk for a variety of reasons. In particular, Harlem and some areas in the Bronx have higher levels than average of childhood asthma. And we've been seeing for weeks now unsafe conditions for healthy groups when it comes to air quality on top of extremely hot and humid temperatures. So it's important that we transform our schools into climate ready safe havens for youth, especially those that have these cardiac, respiratory, and renal conditions, all these things that are exacerbated by extreme heat. Moving on to Introduction 1065, this would require the Department of Parks, Recreation, and other associated city and state agencies to coordinate on a plan that would grow and protect the urban forests. And this treats trees like the critical infrastructure that they are, and makes sure that they have stable long-term care and they aren't relegated to something that takes priority for million trees initiatives as administrations decide to. It's something that's going to be baked into how the city operates through this legislation. So it would require 10-year updates to the plan, and it would also integrate the collection of LiDAR data, that's light detection and ranging, which would provide us with much more detailed, granular data to track the status of the urban forest. And we want to see this bill move forward with time-bound goals, reaching 30% urban canopy cover by 2035. There needs to be some language accounting for health and environmental and climate justice. And we also know that the Department of Parks and Recreation needs 1% funding for parks and accounting of distinct needs of trees at various points throughout their life cycle. Moving on to Introduction 259, this bill would preserve trees on private and public property, in particular trees that are at least 55 inches in circumference and larger. And this is really important because this protects our mature trees, which are the ones that provide a majority of the cooling benefit that is going to be increasingly important as we have to deal with climate impacts. And lastly is, at least for this section, is Introduction 495, which would require the Department of Transportation to conduct a pilot project on the use of cool pavements. And cool pavements are a part of the sort of smart surfaces toolkit, repurposing parts of our infrastructure that are actually exacerbating heat and turning them into part of the cooling solution. So this is especially critical in areas with very little green space. And when combined with other technologies like cool roofs, green roofs, solar roofs, and vegetation, the cooling benefit can be 4 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a really substantial change. Moving on to the next slide. So Objective 5 is focusing on changes that we need to see in NYCHA properties. For one, we need to see proportional investment into energy efficiency. And that's because seniors are the fastest growing population within NYCHA properties. So we need that investment to match the amount of risk that they're confronted with when it comes to heat-related illnesses. We also want to remove barriers for AC use and access. That would require the waiver of fees and utility fees for free AC units. For example, like those distributed through the Get Cool NYC program. We don't want to see economic burdens or housing security put at risk for participation in those programs. As for long-term cooling, low emissions technologies have to be an integral part of the plan forward. That would mean that we see a lot of building envelope upgrades to NYCHA properties, as well as heat pump installations. We know that for the Clean Heat for All challenge, there is some heat pumps being distributed, but over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, in order to scale up to what is necessary, there would need to be 156,000 more installations of heat pumps. And then another recommendation we have is we want to see the new Resilience Hub program, which would be a retrofit of existing community spaces to offer a variety of new services like cooling, resource navigation, emergency supplies and planning, backup power for power outages, and community programming and coordination. That needs to be rolled out with heat vulnerability in mind, and really making sure that the neighborhoods that have the highest index scores are the ones that are first served by this program. And lastly, moving on to Objective 6, which is involved with the collection of heat health related data and analyzing community impacts while sharing the findings with the New York City Environmental Justice Advisory Board. As of now, there's a lot of data being collected on the demographic side of things, but it would also really benefit from collecting data on the heat vulnerability index as well as social determinants of health. This would really help people understand the risks more clearly and make them closer to home. The current data doesn't really capture the full picture of neighborhood level conditions. So some examples of that are hyperlocal heat islands, where we see much hotter temperatures than the city average, and neighborhoods that have multiple sources of particulate matter air pollution. So that needs to be taken into account. And next slide. With that, I'll pause for any questions from the audience. And I guess we will go to the chat to collect questions just to make it a little bit easier. And I think probably we can do raised hands, right?
Yeah, it would be great if folks could put their questions in the Q&A. But it seems like since we don't have a lot in the Q&A, Caleb, if you want to do raise hand, that's totally fine.
Okay, I see Howard's question in the chat. Is there a cooling law in NYC or New York State, or is there one being written, and is it based on temperature only, heat index, and or wet bulb? Did you want to say more on that, Howard? I see your hand raised.
Just want to say thank you to all my friends in WEAC. First met Peggy Shepard almost 30 years ago, so it's fantastic work. I'm from Chicago, part of the People's Response Network, started 3.5 years ago. And unfortunately, we just had a state law passed, the first cooling one in Illinois, that is only based on temperature. And it was originally based on 80 degrees, and real estate developers, big time, got in and raised it to 90 degrees. So we'd like to see examples that are much better than that, if you could share anything with us.
So do you want to take that question?
Yeah, I mean, in New York City, that is also something that's just like still a problem. I mean, I remember it was 2 years ago, or, on like discrete extreme heat days, there is a mandate to sort of lower temperatures, but otherwise, yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a big problem that doesn't exist at this point for New York. And that's, yeah, one of the items in the extreme heat agenda is important.
Looks like there's a couple of questions in the QA.
Okay, I see Helena's question. Are there responses to extreme heat from NYC that are working? Where could they be better? So one part of that is the cooling centers. We're glad to see that the program exists, but we do need to see a lot more support for it, as it's not an actively funded item in the city budget. And we also released a cooling center audit and report that went through a variety of recommendations generated by our members, including improving wayfinding, making sure that there is advanced communication about where the cooling centers are, and what are the programs offered at the cooling centers. So those are some of the things that we see as good, but we want to see major improvement. Did anybody want to add anything to that? Okay. Moving on to Catherine's question, can you speak a little bit more about cool pavement technologies and tell us about any recent successful installations here in NYC that might be reducing heat island effect? As far as cool pavement specifically, I don't have any like specific examples that come to mind, hence why we need this pilot program. I know that Cool Neighborhoods NYC had a suite of different like cooling materials, whether it would be cool roofs or pavement coating deployed through that program, but I don't know a lot of details on that. So if someone wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, Caleb, I can say the city does have a commitment to cool pavements, meaning like it can range from things like that can be just sort of lighter colored concrete, which is kind of but it can really also be like more gravelly type of pavement that's, you know, absorbs water also. It could also be like I think they consider like the green bike paths part of a cool pavements program, like a little bit lighter, it's shade, and then a lot of those are shaded. And there's it's sprinkled around the city. Like there's some, I know Brooklyn and has had a good number of sort of little cool pavement projects, but they're pretty small at this point and haven't done any kind of major changes to the city. But we do need to see a lot more of that across the whole city, because right now most asphalt is pretty dark colored and very hot.
Thank you. I see another question that I can go ahead and take on really quickly. Are cooling centers open 24/7 when the THI hits a certain number like 80 or 90 and or AQI hits 150 or 200 and or mobile cooling center buses or neighborhoods most at risk for heat deaths? No, they aren't open 24/7. The cooling center program is subject to whatever the operating hours are for either the city facilities or partner organizations that are hosting cooling centers. So that's why we need dedicated funding for it, because a lot of the issues associated with being able to open cooling centers to the extent that we need have to do with staffing levels. And that's not something that can be addressed without a dedicated funding stream. And then I see questions from City Limits interns. Do you feel society's heat issue can only be addressed if it is not only acknowledged as an environmental issue, but also a race and class issue? Are you working to organize with racial justice and economic justice groups as well? Well, actually, I mean, we can we come back to that one? Because I think that's a great transition to the next part of, okay, great. But we'll come back to that, definitely. Have any of the 2022 extreme heat priorities been achieved?
I can rattle off some of them. You know, a lot of the agenda items are pretty long term. And so some of the ones that you see in 2021 or 2022 are still in 2023, because they're things like, you know, make NYCHA sustainable, which obviously is a many, many years long process. But there are some things that we have achieved in the shorter term, which is really exciting. Like the home energy assistance program, for example, we wanted there to not be a requirement of medical need in order for people to get AC units. So that was completely waived for the past couple of years. And this year it's still like older adults don't have to, you know, sort of say that they have a medical need to get an air conditioner. You know, we know, like in our conversations with the city around the cooling centers, that they're trying to work on creating more enticing cooling centers. And that's a lot in response to a lot of the work we did around the cooling center work. There have been different bills passed around green roofs, cool roofs, data for New York City, improving the data that comes out. New York City, I think it was about a year ago, sort of revamped their climate and heat data portal, which is really exciting. So there's certainly a lot of things that have been achieved in our that we've laid out in the extreme heat agenda, but a lot of it is pretty long term. So they'll continue to be in there for a long time as we work on it.
Do we have time for more questions, or should we transition to the next part? I'm seeing some in the chat. Okay, well, I'll go back to the city limits question. So yes, REACT does recognize that we need like an intersectional path forward, recognizing race and class and how we respond to extreme heat. And as such, we have convened a diverse group of organizations that are working on various fronts in diverse communities to address extreme heat. So one of the members of our new Extreme Heat Coalition, Groundwork Hudson Valley, we have Kevin Wickersham, who is the Climate Resilience Manager there, to speak to the Extreme Heat Coalition and some of the policy items that are top of mind for us this year. Kevin?
Thank you, Caleb. Good to see you. My name is Kevin Wickersham. I'm the new Climate Resilience Manager for Hudson Valley, Groundwork Hudson Valley. Many of you might know Oded, who served in that position for quite a while. He's still with us, transitioning to a board member, but really big shoes to fill, and I'm happy to be here. We have a few other members of Groundwork Hudson Valley here as well. Jeannie Raven, Ashley O'Brien, and Candida Rodriguez, who really helped me get up to speed. So just wanted to recognize all of them. I'll be pretty quick, but as you all likely know, one of the aims of the Extreme Heat Coalition, one of our priorities is to get funding through DEC to fund some of these important opportunities. We've been making really good use out of a DEC environmental justice grant that we got a few years ago, supporting our heat mapping and climate response action plan for Yonkers. Has a lot of similarities to all the great work that WEAC does in the city and beyond. Huge part of the plan is engagement of local residents through our Climate Safe Neighborhoods program and our task force, a bunch of great members of the community that help us out with a lot of work. We also have great relationships with the New York Sea Grant Consortium, the New School Urban Systems Lab, the Sarah Lawrence College Department of Economics, and NASA Develop, just to name a few. There's many others, but they lend their academic and technical expertise to what we do. And essentially, one of the main things we've done is use GIS mapping and other technology to make clear linkages between redlining real estate practices, impervious surfaces, tree canopy, sea level rise, demographic trends, and all the other indicators of climate change to identify neighborhoods that are most vulnerable, to extreme heat. So using this data and feedback from our neighborhood groups, we've deployed, we've worked with the city of Yonkers to deploy our Green Team, which is a collection of public school students in Yonkers, 30 of them strong this summer. They've been working outside for the past couple of days, and which any of you that have felt the heat outside and experienced the heat islands know that's not so easy. So many kudos to them. But one of the things that we mentioned that has a real connection with the Cool Surfaces program that you're all talking about and is inspired by the New York Cool Roofs program, the Green Team paints the roofs of housing units. We just finished one, I'd say a week and a half ago. It paints them different colors so that instead of absorbing heat, which usually they're black asphalt, they can be as much as 190 degrees, which anybody knows that's much too hot. If you paint them something much more reflective, like we have white industrial paint to put on there, it can reflect all of that heat, and it can lower the temperature inside of units, particularly for the people that are at the top floors, by 30%. So it makes a big difference, particularly in public housing that we work with in Southwest Yonkers and points near there. Let's see. It also helps reduce our carbon footprint of the city of Yonkers. Estimation is that every 2,500 square feet painted This way it can reduce our footprint up to a ton of CO2. So it's really valuable. We've started doing it recently. We're looking to do more roofs, and believe me, the housing folks there want us to do them. So we're trying to get them scheduled as well. Another effect it has is to reduce power demand so that residents don't need to use their air conditioners as much, or it's hard to get away from that in the summer, but they can at least turn them a little bit lower, reducing the greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere. A couple other things I'll just mention really quickly if I can. We're working with the city of Yonkers to create an urban trail for walking, running, and bicycling. It's called the Yonkers Greenway. It'll eventually stretch from Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx to the Yonkers waterfront. And it'll promote options other than driving for Yonkers residents that want to go south, or those that want to come north to Yonkers for either commuting, recreation, or what have you, which will also minimize the CO2 in the air. Just a final word about our community education events. We do a great amount of outreach and community education at senior citizen centers, libraries, local YMCA, faith-based organizations, and other locations, making sure that people know about cooling centers in the area. They know the symptoms of heat stroke and other health risks so that they can prevent them. So those are some things that we do. I see a question in the chat there really quick, not to step on anyone's toes, but it says, Kevin, this is super important data about roofs and more. Can you put this in the chat or email it to us with WEACT? Absolutely. I'll email it to you so I get a more complete range of it than I get on the internet right now.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
So as we transition to the next section, that's what working with Groundwork Hudson Valley is a crucial part of us expanding throughout the state, because geographically we recognize that urban centers throughout New York State have this heightened burden when it comes to dealing with extreme heat. And we're mobilizing to ensure urban, historically marginalized, and vulnerable communities facing extreme heat are protected through policy, adaptation planning, and resilient infrastructure interventions that advance health equity. We also put the link for folks who want to follow the work that we do in the Extreme Heat Coalition in the chat. So please stay tuned there. And I'll pass the mic to Annie, who has some announcements for plenty of upcoming events continuing this work.
Thank you, Caleb. Hi, everybody. Really grateful that you're all here with us today talking about a very important topic. My name's Annie. I'm the Climate Justice Campaign Manager here at WEACT, and I want to share if this is something that is really important to you, and you feel the same sense of urgency that WEACT feels on this issue. There are a couple of more events that we're going to be hosting this summer to both push our advocacy agenda and really accomplish some of the policy recommendations in our extreme heat agenda, as well as prepare our communities and our neighbors for increasing extreme heat events. And so the first thing I want to mention is that this was the introduction to our extreme heat agenda for 2023, and we're going to continue this advocacy and following into next week. So if you are located in New York City and you would like to join us on Thursday, July 13th, we're going to have a rally in City Hall Park at 12 p.m. ahead of the stated meeting, calling on our city council members and our city agencies to pass our policy recommendations that Caleb outlined in our extreme heat agenda, and to really take forceful action around extreme heat. I think for too long we've seen very apathetic movement on this issue around the city, and so we have some really clear recommendations that, as we've mentioned, we've had for years, and we want to see some movement. And so we're gonna, no pun intended, turn up the heat, and I hope that you can join us. And so I'm going to drop thank you, LJ just dropped the link for you to register. But yeah, we'll be meeting at City Hall Park at 12 p.m. and my contact information is there, so I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them. The second event that WEACT has been spearheading this summer is around emergency preparedness. And we have taken on doing really localized emergency planning for climate change. In northern Manhattan, which is the area where most of our members live, we see impacts from both extreme heat and flooding, increasingly impacting our members. Flooding can come from these summer thunderstorms. It can also come from coastal hurricanes, but the extreme heat is really the insidious threat that is, often underappreciated in terms of risk. And so we've been hosting a series of workshops around northern Manhattan, giving people really tangible tips on how to stay cool this summer, how to prepare for flooding this summer. We've also created what we're calling the Climate Ready Uptown Plan. It's a pamphlet that has tons of information. It's packed with both data, but really tangible ways to absorb this information for community members. It is really central and focused on northern Manhattan, but there is useful information in there for anybody. And so if you are in New York City, we're having a workshop this Saturday at 11 a.m. At the Hamilton Grange Library. Address is on that link, and you can, and thank you, LJ is dropping links for you to, oh no, not to register for this. I'll drop a link for you to register for this, but if you are in the area and would like to join us and learn a little bit more about how to prepare yourself and your household for extreme heat, all are welcome. And we'll have a couple more of these workshops throughout the month, which you can see on the link in case the Saturday doesn't work for you.
And we also have, if you want to find out a little bit more about extreme heat and some of the work that we have been doing and listening to some of our members who've been part of this work, WEACT has a podcast called Uptown Chats, and we have an episode. Our most recent episode that dropped for June is about extreme heat, calling it too hot to handle. So myself and my co-host, Jaren, we talked to some members from our climate justice working group about their experience with extreme heat advocacy. So definitely take a listen, weact.org/podcast. And it's also available on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and Amazon Music. So definitely, if you want to hear a little bit more about the work that we're doing, please check out the podcast as well. And I think I'm going to pass it back to Caleb to close us out.
All right, and just to wrap things up, here's all our information about how to stay in contact with WEACT and the work we do. We have members from all over, and if you are in the Manhattan area, we have monthly membership meetings. So please feel free to reach out to us and get involved at whatever level feels right for you. Yeah, thank you all for your time, and we look forward to continuing this work. Yeah. Appreciate everyone.